Welcome back to NeuroDiverse Christian Couples. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Dan, and today we're excited to have back with us Dr. Jim Wilder. So welcome, Dr. Jim.
Good to be with you, Dan and Stephanie.
So Dr. Wilder's full bio is in the show notes, but if you've not heard our previous podcast with Dr. Wilder, here is a very short bio. Dr. Wilder has been in training leaders, counselors for over 30 years and on 5 continents. Jim grew up in South America and is bilingual in English and Spanish. He's the author of 19 books that have a strong focus on maturity and relational skills. Dr. Wilder has served as a guest lecturer at many universities and seminaries. He also has an extensive clinical counseling experience and is the chief neurotheologian at Life Model Works. The Life Model study findings were published in Living from the Heart, Jesus Gave You. So, welcome again.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So for those of you who are listening who may not know, we're doing some groups right now, and a lot of them are based on Dr. Wilder's work. We're currently doing Escaping Enemy Mode, and next semester the guys will be revisiting Rare Leadership combined with the other half of church. And ladies, we will be doing Living from the Heart Jesus Gave You, which talks about fear bonds and love bonds, which is what we're going to talk a lot about today. And we'll be combining that with Joyful Journey as a practical guide. So, Dr. Wilder, when I was recently reading Living from the Heart, Jesus Gave You, the concept of fear bonds and love bonds kind of came up and how to get out of those. But I'm also simultaneously reading Escaping Enemy Mode. And it seems like if a couple is in an enemy mode cycle, or if one spouse has experienced trauma A or trauma B from their spouse, that seems like that would create a fear bond. So will you kind of give us an overview of how fear bonds get created in relationships?
Yeah, the fear bonds will inevitably be, there's something that's going to be painful about this that I don't want to experience. And what ends up happening in unhealthy relationships is that we use these painful things to motivate ourselves and others. So, for example, a way of doing that would be, well, my wife's going to be mad if I don't get home soon. That's using fear to motivate you to get home. If you were to say, my wife is going to feel much more loved and happy if I get home soon. Now you're using a positive thing to motivate the same behavior. So you could say, I want to be home soon because I like my family to really feel loved and I like the good time so that, we can have together. Or we can be avoiding upsetting the other person. Sometimes fear bonds are created by deliberately upsetting somebody. Let's say, I'm going to get really mad at you if you do this or that, or I'm going to give you the silent treatment and create some attachment pain, or, there's a variety of ways that we learn to motivate ourselves and others. And the idea is to take any one of those that we use regularly and say, would there be another motive I could use instead of a negative one that would get me to act or respond or contribute to the relationship?
So then some relationships can really have, if there's been extensive trauma, either A or B, and I think that's from Joy Starts Here, that trauma A is like rejection, abandonment, the lack of things that we need in a relationship. Mm-hmm. Trauma B, negative things, abuse, psychological, spiritual, physical violence, whatever, that can create that. So how does enemy mode connect with trauma and connect into this fear bonds that couples may experience?
Well, yes, the thing about enemy mode is when the brain is in a positive attachment experience, the brain will do 2 things. It'll share the pain that the other person is having. So if you're sad, I'll be sad. If you're angry, I'll be share your anger. If you're afraid, I'll share your fear. If I caused you pain, I'm going to share the pain I caused you. And so that mutual experience is part of a healthy attachment. And the brain also calculates the least harmful outcome. So if, for instance, if I don't care who pays the bill, I'm going to run the bill up as high as it's convenient for me, right? If I'm going to pay the bill, then I'm going to be careful about how much I'm going to spend. And so by sharing other people's experience with them, whatever we do to them or with them, our brain is always calculating, well, how much pain is that going to cause me? How much difficulty is that going to cause me? And so figuring the least harmful option is part of being out of enemy mode and in a relational mode. When you're actually in enemy mode, our brain can actually calculate that causing you some damage or pain or upset would be to my advantage. I'm going to win. So I use pain to win as opposed to something to share and to minimize in our relationship. So the two things are very closely combined together, the attachment, sharing pain, and the least harmful option.
So what does you use the word shared experience? That's a tough word sometimes to consume, the concept of it. Would you, my kind of interpretation on that is perhaps more from a physical representation. If you see somebody get hit by a car, for instance, there is a natural cringe in you where you recognize that that's not pleasant. I don't have to actually be the one hit by the car to recognize that's unpleasant. Is that an accurate analogy from a emotional or relational experience for the same idea? I see someone betrayed. I see someone made sad. I see someone happy.
Yeah. We're talking essentially about the mirror neurons in the brain that resonate when we're seeing some experience that someone we're connected with or care about in some way. And if it's intense enough, we can actually react to, respond to emotions in people we don't know at all. So, we can see a person we don't know hit by a car, and it's just they're enough human, and we're enough human that will resonate with that. But the closer we're connected with somebody, the more nuanced and the more subtle our connection continues to be. So we pick up on smaller cues, and we're more likely to resonate with them. Our brain uses that. We might call it empathy, but it's also, we use it to predict the outcome of interactions and a lot of different functions. But it is that resonance you're talking about.
If that's something we're not naturally heightened in, let's say you could measure this on a negative to positive scale. Mm-hmm. And let's say we're a 0. It just doesn't resonate one way or the other. Is that something that is learnable?
It is, but usually the reason why people are not resonating much at all is because the training range has been exceeded. They've been exposed to feelings that are too intense. And so you have to actually start out with fairly small feelings and try to resonate with those, pick up on those cues. Or your brain will go, don't get into this, it's a bad idea. So, but it's part of the cingulate cortex function, and provided there's not excessive damage to that, you will do all right. So, and it takes a fair amount of physical damage to blow the circuit out completely.
Does it have to be a real example? Is that something I could learn from a movie?
You could learn it from a movie, yes. Mm-hmm. Again, the problem with movies is they tend to turn the amplification up on emotions and make them as intense as possible. So it will be hard to, for instance, to check with the movie and see if you've got it right. Because one of the processes of saying is, I feel like you're a little bit sad today. I feel like you're a little bit withdrawn today. I feel like you're a little bit tired today. I think feels like you're worried about something today. And if you have somebody honest that you can check with, then you can say, oh yeah, I got that one right. And of course, the movies don't provide that function.
So in the situation of a neurodiverse relationship where the mirror neurons might not be working properly, what is the effect on the non-autistic spouse if they do not have a spouse that's actively sharing their experience or resonating with the feelings and checking in, because they don't notice them unless they are really amplified? They're not really noticing the difference in nuances. What kind of effect does that have on the non-autistic partner in the marriage?
Well, one of the important parts of this resonance circuit is figuring out how big a deal this is for me. And so what I actually have used historically as part of the counseling process is to create a scale from, let's say, 0 to 100 about how important, how big a deal something is for me. And then be able as a couple to be able to consult that scale. So, how important is my being late on my taxes on the overall scale? Would that be larger than having one of our children lose an arm? Or would that be smaller than that? Would that be larger than having the dog run away? I mean, we compare these scales together. But what ends up happening is if you have no scale, no reference point, it's very hard to get to a sense that anyone knows how important something is to me. And of course, intimate relationships are all about knowing what's important to the other person. So, if we're not intuitive about it, we have to create external scales we can refer to and go back and say, okay, I can predict or I can understand that this is how important something is for you. It might not be the same thing for me. I mean, for instance, if I speak to you and you don't answer, for you it might be a 7 on the scale, and for me it might be a 20. It's we can each have our own scales, but again, we have to have some way of communicating to each other exactly how important something is. Otherwise, we feel unimportant, and it's hard to get close to anybody when they feels like we're unimportant, isn't it?
Right, back to joy building, hesed, and having a marriage group identity. I'm for you, I enjoy being with you, and we're in us. When it's low joy, low hesed, and we don't feel like we're in us, that seems like that is sets someone up to be in enemy mode. Simple, I'm calling stupid, foolish enemy mode, and then intelligent enemy mode. So some of the questions that came in about that, because I do want to kind of get back to fear bonds in a moment, especially when there's been trauma and abuse. But you state in the book, secure attachment can eliminate enemy mode. And so someone asked a question, how? How could secure attachment eliminate enemy mode? Did you mean globally? Did you mean forever in the relationship? How would you define that?
Well, secure attachment, when you have been, your brain nervous system has been well trained in secure attachment, you always will have a preference to share experiences with others. As far as secure attachment, it's like I'm a relational person at all times. And so since that's a very important part of me, I will always have my relational responses on when I'm responding to other people. The insecure attachments are ways of avoiding trying to connect with people who are not available for me. But secure attachment says I'm always going to be trying to connect. I'm always going to be trying to have some understanding of what's happening for you. And so, even in James, the book of James, salvation is described as the first signs of salvation is you'll be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, and you're prone to understand other people. So again, it's what I'd call it, the development of a secure attachment is happening right there. And the problem is the person with a secure attachment, that just means my nervous system stays on and runs right. It doesn't mean that I have a good attachment with other people, because how well the relationship runs depends on how your attachment is doing as well as how my attachment is doing. But with a secure attachment, I'm going to feel connected with God, be able to talk things over with him, even if my relationship with you happens to be blown up at the moment. So I think we tend to think of secure attachment as everything will always be all right with all other people. And that's not what secure attachment means. It means I'm securely attached to myself. My nervous system stays in a stable relational mode.
So I'm going to tie that question to another one we got. Does that mean from a relational circuit perspective, there's really just on or off? Is there a neutral?
Not that we've been able to find on the scans. It's either your circuit is up and running or it's off and saving burning sugar. Off is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just like I don't need it right now.
So let's play pretend and you're in work mode and you're in the groove and circuits are off, right? You don't really need them right now. I'm doing a thing. Mm-hmm. So in that case, enemy mode becomes as you are responding to an interruption, not because you're necessarily in an off mode in the task. Is that an adequate way to express that?
Correct. I'm predicting that this interruption is going to be hostile to me in some way. You're not going to be on my side. You're as opposed to sort of just waking up and going like, what? Or what's going on? It's off, but I want it off because I don't want to be connected with you. It's there's that additional feature, which you're pointing out correctly.
So if you're in task mode of the flow, like most of us can be, and then there's an interruption and you snap at that person, or you, if I'm remembering some of the definition, when I want the object or you or the person to go away, and I want you to stop interrupting me, because that interruption is a threat. I don't even have to think you're going to do anything to me, but you might ask me to do something. You might want me to stop what I'm doing. So if I want you or the problem to go away, that's when, if my relational circuits are off, I've slipped into simple enemy.
Yeah, right. Otherwise, we just have a slow wake up. It takes about 190 to 120 seconds to get all the chemistry running again. It's like, oh, now hold on a minute here. Let me connect with you. I got to get back from where I was. And that would be non-enemy mode, just waking up from being off. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned James, and there's an interesting part of this. There was another question related to how do you blend the question kind of focuses on the early part of James 4. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from the desires that battle within you? What is the relationship between enemy mode and just our sin nature? Is from one's a physiological thing and the other is a sin nature. Is there and maybe that's not science discernible on a scan or of any kind, but I mean, certainly there is a relationship that your experience has kind of given you.
I think the sin nature would certainly exploit and prefer more enemy mode behaviors. They're to my advantage because the brain predicts it's going to be less painful. If I stay away from you, I don't connect with you. Whereas learning to love others and stay connected with them, is something that we have to some degree, acquire from a good relationship with God. If he cares about you, that means I have to learn to care about you too. But for my own self-interest, I'd rather not be bothered by you, perhaps, So the sin nature will prefer the malfunction, whereas spiritual nature says, even though it might hurt me or might be painful or might be difficult, I have a reason to learn how to do something that will please God. That's the best I can sort of articulate the answer to that. I'm not sure if it does justice to your question or not, because, obviously we can't just look at the brain and go, oh, there's some sin nature right there.
But if only we could.
Tie into, as a man thinks in his heart, so he is. So if I've got a proclivity or a temperament towards anger and yelling and screaming and doing those things, and I haven't learned self-control or master that, that's going to manifest certainly differently in enemy mode. Would that kind of tie that together?
Well, yes, what'll end up happening is if you've, in your heart, you want to be the top predator and, you want to make sure that everyone else is afraid of you, you'll actually be quite proud of those attributes. And I've met any number of people who are. And if in your heart, you said, I want to be pleasing to God, it says, I'm highly reactive and all these things are going on, but it doesn't bring me joy. It doesn't make me feel like, that's great. I just, I want to grow out of this somehow or another. And so, I have people both ways. I have some people who are trying to get better at enemy mode because they're after the win. And I have other people who are pretty good at enemy mode, but they're trying to, find their way out of it because in their hearts, they would rather be loving and caring. So your absolute level of how enemy mode-ish you are doesn't really tell us where your heart is. It's what you do with kind of the wiring you've been given.
So to maybe expose, hopefully not my confusion of brain anatomy, if your amygdala goes off from a perceived alarm, it would be your prefrontal cortex that is engaging all of what this is where I am from a heart posture, and I either catch this or I enhance it or I do something to the alarm. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair
That's
place
right.
to put
Yes.
that decision?
Yes, exactly right. You've named it correctly. That's the way the system runs, and you can actually pick that up on the brain waves that it's kicking in fractions of a second later and going like, wait a minute here, let's have a look at this alarm that just went off. I'm not sure it's current. It was true in the past. I'm not sure it is now. Let's have a look.
5 books later, I know 2 parts of the brain.
There you go.
Excellent.
Awesome. Another person really didn't seem to make the connection of attachment and hesed, which, to me, they seem kind of synonymous. But could you flesh out a little bit of attachment and the hesed piece?
Let's see. I'm not sure. When we look at the Hebrew language for the word that means attachment, the word that's used in Hebrew most frequently is hesed. So that would just be the translation into Hebrew of what we currently mean by attachment. So it's a place in which I share a connection with you. And when the attachment's a healthy one, it's something in which I look out for your best interests as part of that attachment. If it's an unhealthy attachment with hesed, it's a way in which I will exploit you for my own benefit. So hesed can be used for an unhealthy attachment or a healthy attachment in the Hebrew.
Okay, because there was even a question kind of about cult mentality. And so if you can use that hesed and that in an unhealthy way to kind of build your followers to be a predator, to use intelligent enemy mode, to build a toxic group identity for the purpose of exploitation. That's like the negative or opposite use, so to speak.
Yeah, sure. Everything in Scripture and Christian life can be used particularly with fear bonds, to create unhealthy relationships. So God's wrath can be something you can control people. You can do it with you're supposed to love and respect your leader. You can do it with things like you're supposed to submit. Submission is another topic that's frequently, interpreted in toxic ways. But the original meaning of hesed, as close as we can determine, is that you have a permanent connection with someone else. And for that reason, hesed is given as the reason why you shouldn't have incest, because it's creating a permanent connection that shouldn't be there. So it's, a permanent connection is not always good. There's healthy permanent connections and there's unhealthy ones, and hesed covers both.
So in the case of
a cult, we would think it'd be unhealthy connections.
Right. So even in that case, the motivation of the person creating the relationship is the key in that situation. I can create a relationship with you on purpose for either a good reason or a bad reason.
This is correct. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're in various of the books, it talks about kind of two primary ways of joy building in the brain, with God the Father and your relationship, through Jesus, and then, with other people. So on the autism spectrum, sometimes the special or restricted interest can become an issue outside of moderation. And so one person asked, why can't I joy build by myself? Would you call that a beep, even if it's something like reading or building a car engine or golf, which is not an addictive thing like, say pornography or drinking? Is it a beep if I'm trying to joy build alone because I'm happiest by myself without other people?
Well, that I think really gets the difference between joy and happy. Joy is a amplified process. It accelerates, and it takes two brains to do it. So even if I look at myself in a mirror, I can't do joy. If I am with an inanimate object, I can't do joy because the object doesn't amplify back to me my responses. So joy is an interactive process that activates the nervous system. So there's plenty of ways to actually be happy and quiet by yourself, but it isn't the same as joy because it isn't being amplified by the other what the other component of the event, whereas another human being can do that for me. They can, and in fact, it doesn't even have to be a human being. A dog has considerable joy amplification capacities, and it appears a few other animals don't do as well as dogs, but they can also do it. So, but it has to be a living being of some kind that's running some dopamine system.
So that means you're measuring the response. I can look in the mirror with my brain attached to some kind of machine and notice that some meter didn't move. And I look at a dog and the meter moves. And I look at someone else, my meter moves. But then I look at a baseball, the meter doesn't move. Is that right? Kind of the idea of what you're expressing?
There's a voltage increase. Yeah. You measure the right spot. You can see the activity going up. Right.
So that led me to doing some scholarly research. Whenever I kind of hit something in one of your books, I go, oh, I've heard of that. How's that affected in a neurodivergent individual? And some of the research that I was reading, I mean, it was completely in alignment with what you're saying, although it was talking from the opposite perspective, but they were talking about and studying individuals on the spectrum who don't have their interest in moderation. So they're spending more and more time isolated, more and more time with the object or the collection, or actually, they didn't call it the relational circuit. They were talking about from the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala, the circuit that does relate with other people, which sounds like a relational circuit, can actually almost get atrophied or kind of turned off. And the more you do that and isolate and spend time alone, the harder it's going to be to come back to relate and create joy with other people. So again, scripture is correct. Moderation of all things, even if it's your special interest, because you can't joy build alone. And so you're not damaging your brain, but you're certainly affecting that relational circuit's ability to work and flow properly. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, you asked about beeps, which are addictive type events. They actually do damage the circuit. Your ability to be able to generate dopamine based on human interactions drops as you continue those. There's another set of things that could probably in this, which is things that are self-soothing. And self-soothing are much less, let's say, damaging. But the atrophy is still a factor there. It's like, well, I'm soothing myself, which is more probably serotonin and gabapentin type. I mean, not GABA, just plain GABA. Gabapentin is a chemical alternative, related soothing ones. And then you learn to soothe yourself in the absence of joy. But it feels good. So that would cause atrophy. Addictive type things actually cause a rapid degeneration of the ability to feel joy in human relationships. So when you get sober, it'll take months to actually years to regain your capacity to get joy out of interacting with human beings. And that would be the beeps that are more dangerous than just self-soothing.
So that's two things that we can get better at. You mentioned we talked earlier about mirror neurons and our ability to learn if they are suppressed, or I don't know what the word is for them being inactive, but what else is learnable? Because there's a lot of, I grew up in during school, especially in junior high and high, and it was always said that the brain doesn't regenerate. Once you kill a thing, or once it's grown, you don't get more of them. So don't do drugs, bang your head on the ground. Don't, that was where all the don'ts came from, because you didn't get whatever it was you killed back. Mm-hmm. So what actually is learnable from a neuroplasticity perspective or a relearning perspective? And I don't know if those two things are the same. What actually can you relearn or grow in from a neurophysiology perspective, or whatever the right word is there?
And now you've landed in a rather complex picture with a lot of new data coming in all the time. So we're learning a lot more than we did before. The thing that's seems to be the case most often is that if you lose a neuron, a neighboring neuron has a decent chance of learning what it was that its neighbor did and helping you reacquire the skill. So an interesting experiment was done with people who were had some kind of nerve damage that caused them to be paralyzed. And so they asked them, let's say your hand had lost its ability to move. And you said, okay, now move your hand. And nothing happened. And so, but the person who was helping them was very encouraging. Well, that was a very good try. That was, let's try that again. They found that in the process of some 3 to 6 months of encouraging a person repeatedly to try to move their hand and making a very positive experience, that they were able to get a fair amount of return of ability to use that hand. But now they had to find somebody who would spend hours, basically a day, for months with no response, continuing to be encouraging in order to make that response grow back. So what we have is with neurological defects, most of the time, the fact that we don't get responses very quickly make most people quit. And it's very discouraging to keep going. And you need a lot more practice than you would if things were running, uninterrupted. So the capacity to learn some things seems to be much more extensive than we thought. But the need to practice, and be encouraged is very difficult to produce for most people. So they've got no one to practice this with. And so it sort of becomes like that poor fellow by the pool of Siloam. So I don't have anybody here to help me when the pool is being moved by the angels. So who will help you train and not get frustrated and not quit and keep it in a small enough range that you can keep practicing it yourself. So what that comes down to is that there's more neuroplasticity than we thought, but it's harder than we would have liked to try to engage what we do have. So again, what the limits of those things are, not very well defined. What we have found, though, with people who would be on the spectrum is that if you take it slow and keep the practice low enough levels, it doesn't annoy people to do the practice. You have to find something like, this is not so annoying to practice that I don't want to do it again. And if you keep it in that range, quite a bit of strengthening can be done for all kinds of responses. This hasn't been formally studied because we're not a treatment center. We're just trying to help people regain as much of their normal function as they can. But it's what we've had, reported repeatedly by people who've been on the spectrum that have been working with trying to retrain their nervous system to get better results.
So is that where biofeedback or brain mapping kind of things could be helpful?
Yeah, biofeedback is almost always arranged so it's not going to be too annoying. It's very, very sensitive to your needs and whatever you find rewarding. We don't have biofeedback as part of our training, so we're actually trying to get people to stay in the relational zone with each other and practice. Like a simple skill would be noticing when the other person has had enough and not overwhelming them. So usually it's something simple like, their eyes simply stop moving back and forth. They just like freeze for a second. And most people don't notice that. But if you begin to notice those cues, then you can interact with people without annoying their nervous system. And those kind of simple cues, how to notice when somebody is relaxed and present as opposed to distracted, and how to quiet yourself and getting yourself back and present. So it's observing yourself, it's observing others. Takes a lot of practice, but for most people, we find it improves their relational skills, because whether you consider yourself on the spectrum or not, most human beings are pretty limited in how well they do relationally.
So it brings us back full circle to fear bonds, because here becomes one of the major issues in a neurodiverse marriage. So the marriage has been stuck in an enemy mode spin cycle, which has caused trauma for one or both parties. And so there's a fear bond. And now there's not really the space, let's just say, for the person on the spectrum, they want to practice their relational skill sets, and the wife has a trauma or fear bond from negative interactions in the relationship. And she's like, I can't be the one that practices. Like, I live this on a daily basis. I can't be your practice person. And I'm having a hard time because I'm in a fear bond with you. I'm having a hard time giving you the encouragement you need. How do I encourage you to encourage me? Like, how do I coach you to be relational with me when I'm so dry and desperate for a relationship? I've got to coach you for the relationship, and I need a 5 and I'm getting 0.5 back, and I've got to cheer that on. Can you kind of speak to that? the situation? What does she do in that situation?
Well, I would say the most likely answer is, in order to build your own capacity, you're going to have some joy building relationships outside of the marriage. One of the things that has happened, with the American view of marriage is that it's supposed to be our main source of joy, but historically, that hasn't been the case. Men and women are not that good at interacting with each other. And women have always been much better at building joy with other women than they are with their husbands, historically, in most cultures. So if you have people that you can build joy with and quiet with, that's going to help the person build their capacity. Second, how well you're going to do with somebody that you're practicing with, that you have a fear bond, is going to depend on whether or not you've come to an agreement between the two of you, that you're going to take these fear bonds one at a time and start disassembling them. So if you're making progress on, like, we're not going to go here anymore, we're going to do something, have a positive interaction or motive instead, that is something that builds hopefulness, because that's what we're talking about. What would I need in order to feel hopeful in this situation? And one of the things about hesed, a good attachment, is that it does what's good for the other person, but not necessarily what the other person wants. So Peter makes this point, you can be subject to your masters if you're slaves, but being subject to your masters, Peter points out, might really make your master angry. It might not be what they want, because what's good for them and what they want at the time is not always the same. So one of the things that I would say to people, for instance, is, and in 50 years from now, you're not going to have to fight with your nervous systems to figure out, what's going on, what's good or what's bad in your life. If 50 years from now with your spouse, will they thank you for allowing them to cause you damage, or will they wish that you had done what you could to stop it? Right now, their brain can't figure it out, but 50 years from now and through eternity, that's a very long run. Will they appreciate then what they didn't appreciate now? And for me, this started out with my mother, who had considerable neurological defects. And I decided, 50 years from now, she'll thank me for this. Right now, she's just upset with me for doing what I'm doing. And so a good attachment may end up upsetting somebody else, because you're saying, I'm going to limit the amount of damage you can do to me. And whether you like that or not, we're not going to have that as a basis for our relationship. Then that'll bring up our own fears. Am I afraid that if I don't go along with you, that you're going to leave or, abandon me or stuff like that? A lot of fears are sort of tag teamed in our mind. And so we'll have to start talking that through with Jesus and with our friends. Say, okay, what do you want me to know so that I won't be afraid of this any longer? And what are my alternatives? Because the alternative is not just to put up with stuff. That doesn't get us out of a fear bond. That just gets us beat up.
So it's, we talked a little bit about the circuit from the amygdala back to the prefrontal cortex, and you use the word decide. It sounds like in this situation, it is a recurring decision to decide, I want to stay in this. I want to, especially if I'm the one trying to get better, because I'm going to get limited affirmation out of the self-protection you just mentioned, not out of rejection, but for that particular situation, there's not much return. So I have to decide I'm staying in this and I'm going to accept the small wins over a very long period of time.
The only thing I would say, first of all, I agree with what you're saying. But secondly, I'd just say that that's more the left part of the brain involved, because now we're talking about what is a procedure that I'm going to follow. And so I have to have some winning long-term procedures that are going to be left hemisphere conscious speed, much slower. But say every time something goes wrong, I'm going back to this repair strategy. And my repair strategy is not going to be just to stop bad things from happening, although if I can, I will. They're going to be to try to bring out in myself and in my partner and in my family who God wanted them to be. And so we're going to try to grow our true selves in the middle of this. And it'll be a long, slow growing process, which, by the way, it's a long, slow growing process, whether you're neurodiverse or not. Everybody has got a long, slow growing process. It's more dramatic for some people than others, along the start. So does that make sense to you?
Yeah. So as a reminder, and again, just to make sure I remember how all this works, my alarm is still going off faster than my left brain is consuming the alarms. So there is it almost makes it harder that I've got this alarm fatigue. And I have to be able to figure out, okay, I am going to be deliberate and I am going to exercise against this process that says, I decided I was going to, here's the steps I'm going to take to carry out to continue on the path I wanted. And that is harder when I'm constantly barraged by alarms.
Yeah, that's quite true. Here's the counterintuitive part of the process. Most of the time when there's problems, we're trying to look for ways to motivate ourselves to get energy. And most of the time when the brain is in trouble, it's actually overactive and needs to be quieted. And so there's this comment about God in Zephaniah 3:17, I think it is, or 15. He quiets us with his love. His attachment to us quiets us. And most people, after they've gotten in some degree of trauma or rejection going in their relationship, have a real hard time being quiet together. And so it's actually, we're trying to get each other to respond, when what our brains really need is we need to learn to be quiet together, where we can develop that sense of it's going to be okay to just be in each other's presence. And we can get back to this quiet together reliably. And that's actually pretty good for helping people avoid traumatizing each other as well. So when something is going wrong, as soon as we start to sense, hey, something's going wrong here, let's go back and quiet together, and then we'll try this again. And the amygdala rarely predicts that somebody else will let you be quiet and in their presence, and that it'll turn out well. But the more you practice that skill, typically the better everything else runs.
It's an interesting verse you bring up. That's about the fifth time in the last handful of days I've stumbled onto that verse. And the Hebrew for that verse is incredibly interesting, because it uses love and rejoice and joy all throughout it, even to the point that it cries out with joy. So that juxtaposition of quiet with your love plus the cry out, you can use it in both situations. God is crying out joy over you in that joy aspect of things. You can see hesed all over the Old Testament, especially in the Jewish people. And that grew, it speaks very clearly to those two portions of it. And in both situations, I need to self-soothe. I need to calm down. And someone is for me.
Yes.
And not just someone. It is,
the someone.
The someone, yes. A wonderful verse.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorites.
So in extreme situations, Dr. Wilder, so the research that we've done, only 56% of our neurodiverse Christian couples are actually living in the same room, same house. Some have had gone to in-home separation or living in two separate homes because they don't feel because of their faith they can divorce. But in these situations, there's been some sort of abuse, even stemming to one of the partners having post-traumatic stress. Okay, so we're in this situation. There's been enemy mode. There's fear bonds. People are living in two separate situations, and that's how they're making the relationship work. But a lady said, well, if I'm in post-traumatic stress and fear bond, and this person has maybe had domestic violence or psychological abuse or even sexual assault, whatever the thing was that caused the post-traumatic stress, is it even possible to love bond to that person again? Or what's it going to take? We're living out in two separate spaces, and that's the way I can kind of tolerate you. And then going back to living in the same space, there's a lot of steps that have to happen there. So what are some steps? What would have to happen in this relationship to go from a post-traumatic stress kind of fear bond to being able to be in the same space again?
Right. Well, the post-traumatic stress is, we have to treat that the same way we would a broken leg or something like that. You simply can't train when you're having post-traumatic stress. And the recovery methods are all training. So the first thing you do is we have to do something that allows you to heal from the post-traumatic stress before you can start doing any training. To try to do training before that is simply just keep triggering yourself. It's not good. So the Emmanuel process is one of the things that we find very helpful for the post-traumatic stress side of things. And we just recommend that everything that upsets you and alarms you, go and get Jesus' presence and work through the healing on that sort of thing. But the replacing fear bonds with love bonds is actually a fear by fear process. So to actually rebuild something, you have to say, well, here's the things that I'm afraid of with you that, we're currently using as a dynamic in our relationship. And I recommend for most people, start with an easy one. Like, don't pick the grandmother of all fears, as the place to try to start working things out with each other. Let's just see if we can replace this fear dynamic with something that we both want in our relationship. So take a little corner, and if you can take apart one fear that you're using with each other, and replace that with positive motivation, it gives your brain a pattern to say, okay, well, let's take on another one. And you slowly erode the fear-based interactions that feel necessary to both people. Because, it's like, well, that's just the way you make this relationship work. But if you just say, well, I'm not going to do anything out of fear, you just can't stop being afraid. You have to say, well, let's take each fear I have and make a catalog of them and then pick the easiest one. And if your partner won't agree to work with you, then there's no replacing fear bonds with love bonds. You just are now on the path into how do I have a life where I don't have to live based on fear. And sometimes your partner won't do that for you. So you don't have a partnership anymore.
So one of them that's mentioned in the book on page 164 says like a fear of being shamed. And the fear is I can't let anyone see my weakness or faults. So I must protect my image. I can't be vulnerable. And so if that's my fear and my spouse is giving me feedback and giving it in a right way, in a loving way, because maybe I yelled or I withdrew from the relationship or I ignored her for 3 days, whatever happened. And so now my spouse is coming to me and saying, hey, that wasn't okay. That hurt my feelings. If I have a fear bond of shame, even if that person says it nicely, I'm still going to get triggered then, right? That's my kind of fear bond or my fear I need to work on because of my shame, not necessarily that the person's bringing me feedback.
Well, yeah, it's probably closer to a little bit more like post-traumatic stress. You've probably been toxically shamed in the past. That hasn't been healed. And so every time you touch anything with a little shame, it kicks up your previous toxic shame experiences. So you go and get healing with that. And by the way, I've found that in almost all of these cases, a couple will have next to no creativity on how to replace a fear bond with a love bond or something positive. It's like, well, what do you do instead? The brain will be blank. So processing this as part of a group is extremely helpful. Like, we both agreed we'd like to take care of this one, but what are my options? What could we do instead? And having the group creatively talk with you about, well, here's some other options. Now, the group will almost always be wrong. They give you some options that don't work. I mean, that's just part of groups, But the fact that you're discussing it with people lets your brain sort of out of the little box it's in. It's like, oh, I can talk about this. I can think about this. I can go, well, why don't I like that answer? And what could be better than that? And that creative process almost always needs input from a small community that's, relatively trustworthy to help get creative problem solving going, and then report back, here's the success or failure we're getting. It's really, as you pointed out, very hard to be the encouraging partner when this has been really hard on me emotionally. So having a small group of encouragers that are encouraging you basically to be your best self, not encouraging you to put up with getting abused. We're trying to say, how do you go about continuing to be your best self? What would actually motivate you to look back and say, I'm really proud of how I handled that? And that's what we're talking about when we're replacing fear bonds. That's something we can really be pleased with. And simultaneously, I think God's really pleased. And so if we're talking with him about it, it's like, yeah, that's my child right there. And it almost always needs a community to do it because we're too tired otherwise, not creative enough.
As we are kind of closing today, I want to thank you, Dr. Wilder, for the body of work that you've contributed to, being here today, giving us your time. What's the key takeaway then for relationships? So we've kind of talked about a bunch of things. We've taken listener questions in, but if the relationship has been in this trauma or abuse cycle and the couple wants to stay married and they really want to do the work, how do they get started? What's just the next right thing, the next little thing to do in that process? Is it an elephant? We're going to take one small bite. What do they do?
Well, the prefrontal cortex can get badly focused on externals, what used to be called an external locus of control. So in a relationship or with others, I'm always trying to figure out how to make this work with you, rather than who am I and who was I created to be. And healing always comes back to becoming the person God created you to be, which may or may not work in any given moment with any given person in a given situation. So the thing that happens when you've had a really taxing relationship with someone is that our brain is always going, that isn't going to work. This isn't going to happen. That is this, we're trying to make predictions, which makes us actually under the control of the unhealthiest brain around at the moment. As opposed to, we need to become focused on who are we created to be, and let's help that person develop or at least give them a chance to develop an appreciation for who God has created me to be. And I think that's why we need to have a group of encouragers around us that help us remember who we're created to be, whether it works or not. And the odd thing about that is that has a much better chance of working than trying to please an unhappy brain. And I, at least for myself, need my friends to keep reminding me of that. I need to have those Emmanuel moments where God reminds me of that. And I've also found that at least when you're talking about two people who are Christians, that at some level in their innermost being, they can say to each other, I really do want you to become the person God meant you to be. And if there's nothing else that we can pray about together and agree about, I've been surprised how often, a couple who is antagonized with each other can still agree that, well, whoever God meant you to be is still going to be our best plan here. So I will support that even if I don't understand it or like it. Not everyone will, but I'm surprised how often that would happen. So again, we're going back to this, the point. If God was very, very smart, he designed you to be exactly the best person you could be. And that's what we want to be focusing on. If we come back to that, then joy builds good things for us, and practice quieting ourselves more frequently than we do will help that grow. So I'm not sure that's one single takeaway, but to me, it's a cluster. We're focused on what God wants us to be. We'll make sure we're quieting is enough. And then in that context, we build joy around the idea of developing our true self the way God designed us. To me, that's a nice little nest to focus on or try to find again repeatedly.
Well, we very much appreciate you being with us today. Where can folks find out more about your materials and Life Model Works? Well,
the only kind of external web presence I have is through Life Model Works. They keep track of all of the things that I'm doing. So if you go lifemodelworks.org, that's going to be our single best source. And of course, if it has anything to do with the kind of growth that you folks are developing, it seems like you track me very well. So I think anyone who wants to go and talk with you about it will probably find everything useful that they could. So, you're the resource that I point everybody to if they're talking about neurodiversity in any way. And it's a daily question. So I said, hey, do I have the people for you? So, have them follow you as well.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. There are, as we record this, we are planning for the coming semester in the spring, and there are new groups showing up then.
And he forgot to say, you can find those at www.christianneurodivers.com. You want to go to group coaching. Currently, there's a tab on there that says Enemy Mode for Men. If you want to do a self-study and purchase Enemy Mode and then work through that with the coach or our learning videos, you can do that.
I think coaches are great.
Absolutely. Going through the book, especially Living with the Heart Jesus Gave You, is great to go through with a coach or a counselor.
Mm-hmm.
And we like to always remind you, listeners, there is hope for your future, and you're not alone on your journey.